Welcome to the Nature of Teaching Professional Development webinar series. My name is Rod Williams. I'm a professor and extension wildlife specialist here with Purdue University. Today's webinar is entitled Animal Tracking Part 3. This will be a 30-minute webinar that covers both indoor and outdoor track casting, which are both lessons 3 and 4 in the Animal Diversity and Tracking unit. Now, if you're unfamiliar with animal tracks or tracking, you may want to watch Animal Tracking Parts 1 and 2 for background information needed to complete the activities that we're going to discuss in today's webinar. So what else are we going to cover? As I mentioned, we're only covering lessons 3 and 4. We are going to highlight the targeted grade levels that each of these lessons are focused on, as well as those associated standards. We're going to talk to you about the estimated time to incorporate these activities into your classroom, materials needed to do so, and of course, go through the procedures and hands-on activities. So without further ado, I'd like to share with you the actual lesson plan. So here's what our lesson plan looks like, which is Animal Diversity and Tracking. It does have 5 lessons, and again, we're going to be covering indoor and outdoor track casting. Now let me walk you through the various objectives of this entire unit. And one is to identify wildlife species using just their tracks. We also want to recognize that animal diversity can be high, even when we don't see the animals. We want students to be able to predict which species tracks they're likely to find based on habitat requirements and throughout different types of habitats. And we also want our students to be able to create molds of tracks and interpret animal behavior. So when we're looking at this overview of our unit, I want to point out that we have each of our lessons pulled out, and within each of the lessons, all the different types of standards across subject areas. So let's focus on lesson 3, which are indoor track casting. So you can see that we use next generation science standards, and these are actually hot links. So here we have a next generation science standard for 4th grade. If you were to click on that hot link, it would take you right to the DOE website and show you which exact particular standard that is addressing the concepts therein. Now, if you look at English and language arts, you're going to see that we have quite a few standards that are being addressed. But what I want to point out is, we try to make these as broad as possible, but there is a focal group or targeted grade level. And for this particular lesson, it's really focused on grade levels 3, 4, and 5, particularly for English and language arts. And you can see the same sort of information for lesson 4 as well. What I'd like to do now is jump down to lesson 3, and we'll get you started on how to incorporate this particular lesson into the classroom. So indoor track casting. This activity is really providing students with an opportunity to create these plaster casts of really common species. The estimated time for this particular lesson and activity is around 30 minutes. So that's what you can be planning on if you're thinking about incorporating this into your classroom. And when you're looking at the materials list, there's really not a lot of required materials for this lesson. You need some track molds, and here's a really great photo to show you some of these really high quality track molds that you can purchase online for anywhere from $5 to $8. You need a cheap mixing bowl, spoon, measuring cup, some plaster of Paris, water. There's a suggested reading that goes along with this lesson, and that's Tracks, Scats, and Signs by Leslie Dendy. And then we have a couple of optional materials as well, and that includes things like paint and paintbrushes and a white sheet. And I'll talk more about the optional activities a little bit later in the procedure. So again, when you're thinking about incorporating this into the classroom, the very first thing we want you to consider in the procedure is to explain to students that tracks are really important signs left behind by animals, and that these tracks can provide clues about what an animal was doing. Was it running? Was it walking? Was it searching for prey? We also want you to tell students that these different animals leave different tracks, and that they can identify tracks by examining really key features. And I'm not going to go into the features in this webinar, but if you happen to have a chance to watch Animal Tracking Part 1, there's a great tutorial that really outlines the different types of tracks and some key ways to identify some common species of tracks in that webinar. Now, the second thing, after you've introduced the concept and got the students thinking a little bit about why tracks are important, the next thing we want to do is actually get them to create their own track molds. And to do that, I actually have a video. Instead of reading through all these procedures, I thought it might be more interesting for you to actually watch a video on how that is done with regard to indoor track casting. So let's watch this video.
Hi, I'm Rod Williams, Purdue Extension Specialist with the Nature of Teaching. Today I'm going to walk through the indoor track casting activity, which is in Lesson 3 of the Animal Diversity Tracking Unit. This particular activity requires very few materials. You need some plaster of Paris, a small cup to measure your plaster, a cup of water, a mixing bowl, and a utensil to mix with, and then of course, a track mold. And to begin, you want to take 1 cup of your plaster of Paris, simply put it in your bowl, and take about half a cup of your water, pour it in, and begin mixing. What we're trying to do is get the consistency of pancake batter. If you get too much water, you can always add more plaster of Paris. If you have too little water and your batter is far too thick, you can add more water, add more plaster, whatever the case may be, to get that consistency that you want for pancake batter. So I'm going to continue to add until I get the right consistency, and then I'm going to pour this batter into my track mold. And you just have to spend some time, continue to mix, and the more you do this, the more consistent you become. Now the amount of plaster of Paris you use depends on the type of plaster or mold that you're going to be putting it in. Some molds, the track mold I'm using today is a deer track. And so it requires quite a bit of plaster to fill this large mold. There are other species of tracks, things like squirrels and groundhogs, that are much smaller in size, and you obviously would use a much smaller amount of plaster when filling that particular mold. So my plaster of Paris is at the proper consistency. One of the little tricks I want to share with you on our molds is there's a front and a back portion of the mold. The front portion being where the tips of the digits or the tip of the foot would be. The back of the mold is where the back of the heel or the back of the hoof would be. I always like to mark my track mold with a small dot. That's going to be important later when we go to remove the plaster of Paris track from the mold itself. So the next thing we're going to do is place our track mold on the table. We're going to pour our plaster of Paris mixture that's now the consistency of pancake batter into the mold, and you want to make sure all of that plaster gets to the very tip of the digits, because that's where the really unique and defining features of many of our tracks are. The claws, the tips of the feet, that makes the track really unique and much easier for students to identify. So again, we're going to take our plaster of Paris, and we're going to pour this into the mold. You want to pour it all the way and fill the mold up to the rim, but not above, because it will swell just a little bit. Once you have your plaster of Paris in your mold, you're going to want to tap it, again, to make sure that plaster gets into all the creases and crevices that these molds have, and again, as those defining characteristics of our tracks. So now our mold is poured. We simply want to let that set for about 15 or 20 minutes to set up and harden. While you're doing that, you can actually go and read Big Tracks, Little Tracks, which is a book, part of the lesson, with your students, which takes about 10 or 15, 20 minutes while your track molds are setting up. So I'm going to move this track mold aside, let it set up, and I prepared a track mold for you a little bit earlier, and I'm going to show you how to go about extracting that and what it takes to clean up. So here's our completed track mold. You can see that it's nice and hard, it's completely set up. So now what I'm doing is I'm looking for that black dot, which is indicating to me this is the back of the track mold. That's where I want to begin prying that out, because you can think about an animal, that's how they're going to be lifting their foot up out of the ground. That's the easiest way to extract this plaster of Paris track from the track mold without breaking off the tips of the digits. So I'm going to turn this mold upside down and begin to pry really easily. And I'm going to again use my black dot and begin to pry this track right out of the mold. And there you have it. You can see I've got all the very tips of the hooves, Nothing left in this track mold, completely extracted. And the reason I really like these track molds is it even has the name of the animal. So here you can see it says deer. So the students know that in fact this is a track mold of a white-tailed deer. So there's a completely extracted hoof from our track mold. Here's the bowl and the spoon that I used to make up my mix from earlier when I made this track mold, and I want to show you just how easy it is for cleanup. You want to let your plaster Paris set up in your bowls as well. So once it's set up, you can simply just squeeze the bowls, go around, and that plaster Paris will just break up into small tiny pieces. You throw that in the trash, and then your container, for the most part, is relatively clean. You can do the same thing with your stirring utensil. Simply hold it over the trash can, break it around, squeeze it, twist it just a little bit, and nearly all that plaster Paris will completely come off of your cleaning or your stirring utensil, and then you're set up ready to make additional tracks. It's really important to never pour any of your plaster Paris down the sink. It can set up and hard and obviously clog your sinks. So you always want to dispose of your plaster Paris in a trash receptacle. So with that, that's really all there is to it. So this completes the indoor track casting lesson, lesson 3, again in the unit Animal Diversity and Tracking. We're going to head outside and talk about lesson 4, which is outdoor track casting. So join us here in just a minute as we go outside.
All right, so hopefully you found that video really helpful and demonstrates just how easy it really is to incorporate these indoor track casts. And oftentimes teachers will use this if they don't have access to outdoor space, or perhaps they want to incorporate this lesson during the winter months when the students aren't able to go outside and there's snow in the ground, and these casts may not be the most effective way to do that. So highly used lesson that students have seemed to really enjoy in previous workshops that we've done with teachers. Now I said I would mention those optional activities, and that's really what we're focused on here with 9. So these are additional, more advanced activities in which teachers can create landscapes in which animals might live by drawing trees, streams, and grasslands onto a really clean white sheet. And then you can have the students paint those track casts. So they could just paint this, this cast right here, and then place those and stamp those onto the sheet and create their own story and have additional writing exercises that are affiliated with the track cast that they made indoors. So again, I think this will be an activity that both you and the students really love and enjoy, and it's really informational to the students and really gets them to think about, even despite what type of habitat they might be surrounded by, there's oftentimes far more animals there than we ever realize, and they can identify those just based on the tracks that they leave behind. So now I want to move into lesson 4, which is outdoor track casting, which use a lot of the same concepts that we just talked about and saw in the video in lesson 3, but now we're moving outdoors. So this activity is demonstrating how to create plaster casts of animal tracks out in the field. So again, it's another 30-minute activity with some required materials that mimic very much what we saw in lesson 3 with the addition of some petroleum jelly. So let's start off with the procedure. How you want to introduce this particular lesson to your students. Again, you want to explain to the students that tracks are important signs left behind by animals, and they provide clues about what an animal is doing. These clues might indicate how fast the animal was moving, the direction it was moving, whether it was by itself or with additional animals, perhaps different species. And again, you can explain to students that you can identify these tracks by examining those key features that were described in the webinar, Animal Tracks Part 1. So in this activity, in this lesson, we're going to have students create plaster casts from animal tracks that they find out in nature in different types of habitats. So I've got another video that walks you through exactly how you're going to do this and how you might set this up in your classroom or your woods or your experimental classroom that's adjacent to your school. So again, I'm going to share my screen with you and show you another video on how to do these track casts outdoors.
Hi, I'm Rod Williams, Purdue Extension Specialist with the Nature of Teaching, here to walk you through the outdoor track casting activity, which is lesson 4 in the unit, Animal Tracking and Diversity. In this lesson, we're going to be teaching students how to find animal tracks out in nature and in different types of habitats. And as you can see around, today we're representing a forested habitat. So the first thing you're going to want your students to do is try to find areas within the habitat that animals are likely to be moving through. And so in this situation, you can see a nice forest trail behind me from the forest behind you to a nice small forest opening that animals are likely to visit. There's also a trail behind you and a trail beside you. So we're going to focus in on those animals trails where animals are supposed to be having high traffic areas. And in fact, if you look at this little wetland, this track made by our Forest Service trail, there are actually tracks deposited in those vehicle tracks, and we're going to get a close-up and decide which one of these tracks we want to do our outdoor track casting. So here we have a piece of exposed earth on one of our trails. It's a great place to have your students try to find animal tracks. And in fact, we've got several sets of animal tracks that I've already discovered, made by a couple of different species. So the next thing you want your students to do is to look at the animal tracks, make sure that the tracks are complete enough to make a track cast. Are they too old and too weathered? Do they show enough of the characteristics? And are they covered in too much debris for you to have a really great set? So we'll take a close-up here in a minute, and we'll look at some of the tracks and try to decide if any of these are the ones we're going to want to track cast. So here we have 3 different sets of tracks that I want to walk you through. Here's our first track, and you can see it's relatively fresh. This is a track that we might want to consider. It has a little bit of debris around the track, but the track leaves a really nice impression. I think if we were to set a cast on this track, we would be able to identify it to a white-tailed deer when we were finished, because most of the characteristics would show through. Whereas on this track, you can see this is a much older track, one that had been deposited for some time and has undergone some rain and some weathering. I don't think most of the features, it's really shallow. Most of those features probably will not show up in that track. And here's the last track that I wanted to show you. You can actually see where there's a track here, and the back foot has actually hit the track. So there's actually a track that has 2 footprints in it, making this really difficult to discern what type of animal left it. So we wouldn't want to pick this track. This track over here is too weathered, and that first track is a potential. But we're going to keep looking and see if we can find anything that's a little bit better to make our first outdoor track cast. So I continued walking down the trail just a little bit to see if there were any other pieces of exposed earth that had even better tracks to make our very first outdoor track cast. And I found a really great one right here. So I'm going to walk you through what makes this track superior than all the previous ones that I've showed you. Then we'll get our gear ready and we'll set our first track cast. So I really like this track. It's really deep, has a very deep impression. Very distinct aspects of the track can be revealed whenever we put our track cast. Got pretty clear area around so we can put our mold around. Not a lot of debris. This is going to turn out to be a really great track cast. So now that we've selected our location, we've selected our track, let's get our equipment out. I'll show you that you don't really need a lot of equipment to do this outdoor track casting activity. I like to carry everything that I need right here in my backpack. So I'll show you what I have. So here's our plaster of Paris that we used in lesson 3 activity with our measuring cup. You will need a 2-liter bottle, and what I like to do is cut the top off the 2-liter bottle here, cut the bottom off the 2-liter bottle here, and this inside center ring, which looks like this, is what we're going to use to put around our track to serve as our mold. And I like to keep the bottom of my 2-liter bottle to put my plaster of Paris in to make my mix. And you'll need your mixing spoon, and I just use the water from my water bottle to do all the mixing. I'm not going to go through and show you how to do the mixing in this particular video. If you want to see that, I would encourage you to visit lesson 3, indoor track casting, and I show you the proper way to make up the mixture for the plaster of Paris. So I'm going to stop here, and then the next time you see me, we'll be setting the mold around our track and getting ready to pour. All right, I've got my plaster of Paris mixture, just the consistency I want, that of pancake batter. I'm now going to take this 2-liter bottle mold and place it right over top of the track and push it down in the soil about a 1/2 inch so that none of the plaster of Paris will seep out. Simply take your plaster of Paris, pour it down in the track, use all the mixture that you have, Make sure that the track is fully covered. Now we're going to let this set for about 15-20 minutes, and during this time you can have your students exploring different habitats, using additional equipment, and perhaps finding more tracks to set their outdoor track cast, different habitats with different species. We'll check back on this in about 20 minutes to see how our track cast turned out. Well, it's been about 20 minutes. We'll check on our track mold, see if the plaster starting to set up. Oh yeah, definitely set up perfectly hard. We can now take off our outer mold very carefully. Set that aside. And now what we want to do is from the back, just try to pry up this track mold. Oh yeah, it's going to turn out pretty nicely. Now you may have to take this back to your classroom and clean off the soil just a little bit, but I can already see pretty clearly we've got a great deer track mold that will get cleaned up, and we'll show you that here in just a little bit. Once we take it back to the classroom, run some water over this. Really great deer track that your students can go outside, find themselves different types of habitats, get different types of track cast, and do some really great science, math, and other type of subject areas with this particular lesson. So get your kids outside and let them give it a try. Regardless whether you have your students use lesson 3 in the indoor track casting activity or lesson 4 and do the outdoor track casting activity, we hope your students learn to identify tracks in the outdoors.
So obviously there's some pretty salient differences between lesson 3 and lesson 4. You do use some of the standard techniques in lesson 3 and lesson 4, but it's a great way to get your students outside, get them thinking about different habitats, different aspects about animal behavior, and what to look for when they're out in nature. Now, one thing that we didn't put in the video that I thought I would just share with you, there is an opportunity to have students create an inset from the track molds that they found outdoors. And you can read through how to do that here in item 7. I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing that today because there's really not necessary to do this if you already have the track molds from lesson 3. So again, I think when you incorporate these various lessons into the classroom, your students are going to be really excited about ways to identify wildlife just based on the animal tracks that they've left behind. So at this point, I want to go back to the PowerPoint and sort of walk you through sort of next steps from this webinar. Now, if you really enjoyed this webinar, I encourage you to click on the card that should now be appearing in the top right of your screen to visit our Nature of Teaching YouTube channel. And here we have a whole series of sneak peeks. These sneak peeks are going to be videos on lesson plans that are very similar and directly related to the webinar that you just witnessed. So if you're having a difficult time, click on the card in the top of the screen. I've also embedded the link to the YouTube channel here in this PowerPoint. But if you're in YouTube, you can simply search for the Nature of Teaching in the YouTube search bar. Now these sneak peeks are 2 minutes or less, and they really highlight the activities of what you just saw in the videos in today's webinar. So it's a really great way to get a 2 minute or less excerpt of what that particular lesson and unit might have in store for you. So again, I encourage you to check out those sneak peeks on our YouTube channel. Now, if you're interested in obtaining a certificate of completion for this 30-minute webinar as part of your professional development, now I want you to click on the second card that should be appearing in the top right of your screen. Once you click on that second card, you'll be directed to a short Qualtrics survey to provide us some feedback on the program. Once you complete that Qualtrics survey, you'll be automatically emailed your certificate of completion. So at this point, if you have any questions on how to incorporate indoor or outdoor track casting in your classroom, feel free at any time to send me an email with questions. If you have questions about modifications that I've worked with teachers in the past, I'm happy to share those with you as well. But at this point, I hope you enjoyed learning with me and consider participating in additional professional development webinars offered by our nature teaching team. But until then, I just want to thank you for engaging our youth with nature.